Hey guys, welcome to this video about how you can take your photography to the next level by using raw images instead of JPEGs. So in this video we will delve into the power of RAW. As I've mentioned several times on this channel, this is a really easy way to make your photos better because RAW is a very powerful tool when you compare it to JPEG. So you might have guessed this is a beginner's introduction to RAW, but if you don't consider yourself a novice, you might still learn a thing or two, so don't worry and please stay with me. So first of all, what exactly is RAW? When your camera captures an image, it records the unprocessed data directly from the sensor. Unlike JPEG, which applies in-camera adjustments, RAW files retain all the information, offering multitudes of advantages. So take a look at this comparison. So here we have a more or less well exposed photo. And if we compare the RAW with the JPEG photo, we can clearly see that this JPEG photo has been processed and the shadows are definitely lifted a bit. And the image appears to be a bit more washed out, I would say. But in a situation like this, where you more or less have exposed your photo correctly and the white balance is set accordingly, you can get away with way more on the JPEG photo, leaving the advantages of the RAW image to a minor. So with this photo here, if I apply my Go to preset to the RAW photo, I will reset the white balance. And this is a dark photo, so I will bump up the shadows just a bit. And I'll lower the exposure a tad to keep the details in the highlights. And this is a decent looking photo, I think. So if we do the same to the JPEG, we will apply the preset. I will reset the white balance just as before. Again, if we tone down the exposure and bump up the shadows a bit. And I would say that this looks pretty good. It more or less resembles the RAW photo. Perhaps it's still a bit washed out, so we could add a little bit of contrast as well. So let's try to compare them. These are very similar here in the comparison, and I think it would be hard to see on YouTube if there is any difference. I can see here on my screen that there's a slight difference in the details, that the RAW is a bit better here. And there is like a red color shift here on the black roof, which we could probably change in post. Also, I think that the JPEG is a bit more saturated in the blues as well. But this is just to show that if you get the picture correctly in camera, then the advantages of RAW will be less important than shooting with JPEG. But I personally think that the JPEG still has this HDR look to it, which was popular like 10 years ago. And yeah, I don't want this look to my image. So another thing we can see here on the photo easily is that it has a vignette. And it might also be distorted. I don't think so though, because this is a great lens, but it could potentially be distorted also if you were using a wider lens. So another great advantage of the RAW files over the JPEGs is that the RAW files keep the information of your camera and your lens. So if you want to add any corrections to vignetting or distortion, chromatic aberration, and make corrections to the photo when it comes to the positioning, then you can use the auto functions from Lightroom to do this with the RAW, but this is not possible with the JPEG because it does not save this information. So you could potentially find your camera yourself, but if you have ever tried this in Lightroom, then you cannot really find anything when you choose, for instance, Sony here. It doesn't really give you any options, so it's not possible to find the correct lens profile to change these settings. So one of the most significant advantages of RAW is the expanded dynamic range. And dynamic range is your camera's ability to capture light and shadow in the same photo and everything in between. So RAW files typically has a higher bit depth compared to JPEGs. They can go up to 12 or even 14 bits, whereas JPEGs only go to 8 bits. This simply means that each pixels in your RAW images contains more tonal information than it does for a JPEG. And this provides you a greater detail when it comes to controlling the shadows and the highlights. Because if you take a photo that is overexposed like this one, So the same scene, but we missed the exposure and we want to recover this photo. For the RAW, this is more or less possible to the extent that we will get an image that looks like the one before. We can take the overall exposure down. We can bump the shadows a bit. And I think we end up with a similar photo as the one that was exposed correctly. But if we do the same for the JPEG, you might already know this, but this will not be recoverable. As soon as we try to take down the exposure, all the highlights, you can clearly see that the image starts to fall apart. The information in this overexposed area is simply lost and it cannot be recovered. And this will leave the photo more or less useless. So let's just try to do the same, but with an underexposed photo. We will start with the RAW again. So we will brighten it up by lifting the exposure and lifting the shadows. And this time I will not apply preset just to save time. So we have the information here in the highlights and we have the information here in the shadows. We could add some saturation and perhaps a little bit of contrast, but overall this is a really decent image. So let's try to do the same with the JPEG. We'll lift the shadows and we will raise the exposure. Take down the highlights, add a little bit of saturation and some contrast. And I actually think that this is a decent image as well. But again, we have this HDR kind of look that I really don't like, but it's definitely useful if we need to. So if we try to compare these two, there is a difference in the colors and it's a bit hard to say which is the best. I guess this is a personal preference. So I just think that the point here is that you can get away with underexposing your JPEG more than you can with the overexposing it. Whereas when it comes to the RAW images, it doesn't really matter. You can more or less recover the same information, but perhaps with a slight advantage to an overexposed photo, I think. So now let's look into how you can optimize your shooting with RAW to get the best results when you're out shooting street photography. Because even though RAW is a way more flexible format than JPEG, you still need to make sure that you at least get your exposure to some extent correctly. Capturing a well-exposed photo will always serve as a better starting point than capturing a photo with a bad exposure. So what RAW generally does is that it controls the highlights in a better way, whereas it leaves some of the information in the shadows. This generally means that you should expose a little bit more towards the highlights than the shadows if you want to retain the information in the shadows. For my kind of shooting style, I must say that I more often shoot for the shadows, and then I can always bump the highlights if I need to. So when it comes to white balance, the power of RAW really shines. I know this is an exaggerated example, but this just proves the point on how much you actually can recover with a RAW when it comes to white balance, because this is fully recoverable. So if we take this photo, it is really easy to make this look good with a RAW image. You simply just go to auto white balance and Lightroom will fix the issue here. Of course, you can tweak it if you need to, but this is totally a useful image that you can use and edit to your liking without any problems. And if we go do this with the JPEG and we choose auto again, this is simply not possible to recover the same information to this image. And we get this like purple hue on the image and I cannot fix this even though I try. So this image would have been useless to some extent, I think. And of course this will affect your image if you apply a preset or you just try to change the colors to your liking. Then this will not be possible because the starting point of the image is all wrong. So the white balance adjustment is more or less not important when you shoot RAW because this is fully controllable when you go into the processing. Whereas for a JPEG, this is very crucial because it can ruin the image if you are using a wrong white balance. So generally you can just set this to auto and you can always adjust if there are any minor changes that you need to do without affecting the image in a bad way. And that is by shooting RAW, of course. So when it comes to picture styles or creative styles, if you are using these kind of things in your camera, these will actually not affect your RAW images as it would in the JPEG. But if you like a certain look, you can always apply it to the camera. And then if you look at the images on your screen, you will see the image with this kind of processing on. But when you take the picture, the RAW format, to your editing software, then the effect will not be there anymore. So this is just a creative way to look at the images in a more stylized way than if you don't like to look at a non-processed raw photo. So just a tip for you. So over time, raw processing software has also improved by a great deal. This simply means that the extraction from your raw files has gotten better over time. Like Adobe, they have, during the last couple of years, improved their processing of raw files, which gives you a greater output when you are processing the files with their software. This simply means that you just get more leverage when it comes to controlling the highlights and the shadows. It is important to say that each camera produces different raw images. So a Canon camera produces, I think, something called CR3 raw files, and the Sony cameras have an extension AW something. And for instance, Nikon has NEF files. So sometimes your camera software might not be able to read this kind of format, but usually you can download an update or an add-on to the software that will make it able to read the file, and etc. One of the great things about Lightroom and using RAWs is that you can edit your photos in a non-destructive way, and this means that you can basically edit the photo the way you want and make a JPEG version of it, and then you can go back and make new changes to it and try a different look if you like to. So this was just a really quick video to tell and show why you should use RAW images over JPEGs. I hope that you found this interesting and that you are eager to try out shooting in RAW if you haven't. And if you still feel a bit scared to do this, you can actually change the setting in your camera so it both shoots in JPEG and in RAW. This way you will have a JPEG version of the photo and you can experiment with the RAW version in your editing software. Anyway, this was not an editing video, but you might want to see how I edit my RAW photos, and this you can do in the video that will come up on the screen right now. Please make sure to hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't. It really helps a lot and I really appreciate this. Take care and I'll see you around. Boy.